Hello everyone. Now, I did a request as my subs to vote on what ship line I should be leveling next on the Russian server. And they wanted both IGN carriers and American battleships. Now, considering the UI is still such a mess, and I have pretty huge like FPS stuttering and lag issues with it that seem to like come and go between every patch, I've been mostly playing the US battleships because I find it less frustrating than dealing with the carrier UI, which is honestly quite a mess in this game. Anyway, the first ship to feature is of course going to be the Wyoming, the Tier 4 American battleship. It does have protected matchmaking, which means of course that you can only face ships one tier higher, which is Tier 5. Overall though, the Wyoming is a ship that has always honestly been very strong. It's always been in a pretty damn good state, or in a damn good spot. The dispersion is pretty crap. But pretty much all lower tier battleships tend to have pretty crap dispersion. Of course, there's been significant power creep. I mean, the Wyoming at launch enjoyed quite a powerful position because the only direct competition it had was the Myogi, and the Wyoming is significantly better than the Myogi, which has thin citadel, a thin armor, and only 6 guns. And the Wyoming, of course, has a pretty damn massive broadside of 12 guns, which is pretty insane, especially for Tier 4. So the amount of firepower available is very impressive. But the amount of power creep has started to affect even the Tier 4 Wyoming quite a fair bit, and now we got the Kaiser, who can't really get Citadel. That's a really huge threat to fight. And we of course got the Orion, which is a ship that I consider downright completely broken, like ridiculously overpowered. The Orion just completes its shits on the Wyoming, but you shouldn't feel bad about being absolutely annihilated by a Orion in the Wyoming, because the Orion does that to every other ship in this bracket. There's really no ship that can take that ship on and not get completely annihilated, unless of course the captain is a complete potato. But in general, Orion is of course the new king by far of Tier 4, much scarier than even the Nikolai, because for example the Nikolai can, if you get broadside on the Nikolai, you can quite easily Citadel him, and you can angle against Nikolai AP. Against Orion, of course, there's no real tools to deal with. There's an example, of course, of the firepower. If you do get close enough to be able to bring this firepower to bear, especially cruisers are easy pickings for the Wyoming because of the amount of shells you can put in there. Now, 12 guns doesn't come without multiple weaknesses, though. The firing angles are quite terrible. You have to give a significant amount of broadside to be able to use all 12 of them. You can use 5 guns a bit safer, you can use 4 guns or 4 turrets pretty safely, but if you want to use that full broadside, that full potential, then you have to give a huge amount of broadside, which of course opens you up for quite a punishing return fire. The AA on the ship, it does have some AA, and the AA is kind of the flavor for these American battleships, but honestly it doesn't really reach critical mass on the American battleship line until you really start reaching the North Carolina. You get small increases in AA the entire time. At the New Mexico, you are a bit of a threat to carriers. I mean, you're an annoyance. They might not pick you first if there's other targets to pick, but you are not really going to be something they are actively afraid of. Even a Colorado might not be the priority target for them if they, for example, spot a Nagato or something like that. But once again, power creep has happened in these lines as well, and ships like Gneisenau are notoriously scary for the anti-air they have. So once again, don't expect to receive any sort of protected special status because of this small national flavor, which is anti-air. It doesn't really become a thing until Tier 8, and then after Tier 8, basically at Tier 9 and Tier 10, the amount of health the carriers gain, the planes gain so much health and survivability that the additional anti-air you gain on the Iowa and Montana aren't really that big of a deal either. So Honestly, when it comes to national flavor, the American national flavor of AA is probably the weakest one of them all. The Germans have citadels that are untouchable at pretty much any distance or any range. I mean, you can get lucky penetrating citadels at long range, but that's of course a highly useful perk. They also got Hydro, which is of course a highly useful national flavor. The Brits have the Insane HE, once again, insanely useful flavor. But the American one of being slightly harder to kill for carriers is probably the most underwhelming one. So, especially since it's so situational. Whereas the other two, whereas the other national flavors are highly valuable in pretty much all situations. The Japanese, of course, their national flavor has kind of always been the gun accuracy, the range and gun accuracy, which kind of reaches this apex at the Yamato, where you have 2.1 sigma and this insane penetration. So that's always kind of been their flavor, and the American flavor has always been this anti-air. But having anti-air as a flavor, as I've said, is probably by far the worst. It's incredibly situational. It's only really useful if the carrier is focusing you. So that means not only does there need to be a carrier in the game, he also needs to actively be flying planes around you for you to gain any sort of benefit from this. And even then, the benefit isn't really noticeable unless you're playing in North Carolina, which has, as I mentioned, insanely good anti-air. So when it comes to national flavors, the American line obviously loses out. But that's not to say it's a straight up bad line by any means. I mean, there are very strong ships in this line, and the Wyoming, I would say, is one of these strong ships simply because of the sheer amount of firepower it has. It looks like 3 ships are hunting this Orion in their spawn. I'm trying to help them a bit with him, but honestly I'm gonna predict right now that the Orion is going to kill all 3 of the ships that are chasing him. They are DDs and cruisers, and the Orion kind of one-shots everything. Well, it can shoot HE at them, so angling doesn't help, and especially at these lower tiers, the Orion HE, the massive huge splash damage on it, it breaks the engine, it breaks the rudder, it breaks the guns, it breaks the ships in general, does massive damage and sets them on fire. So all he needs to do is just, well, click HE at everything and he'll probably kill them all, and there's not really much they can do about it. It's a completely unfair matchup, and I won't really blame the players if they end up getting killed by this single dude. Spotting a NASA. I'm not entirely certain what he's doing. You can see smokestack is actually fading into the background, so I can't really see it. I'm gonna try lobbing a volley his way, since that will give us... Oh, it looks like he's actually reversing. I couldn't see his smokestack. I'm trying to see it. It's pretty distracting when there's this background that is exactly the same color as the smoke. You can't really see which way the ship is moving. And yeah, the Nassau is. Now we can see him properly reversing since he's picked up a bit of speed, and I should be able to secure the kill here. Now the Wyoming does eat a fair amount of damage, especially if you're giving broadside, which you kind of have to do to use these guns. But overall, it's a strong battleship, and it does give you this introduction into battleship play, in the sense that you are a very fearsome threat to any enemy. If they give you broadside, you can heavily punish them, but you don't really have much of a torpedo belt to speak of. Your torpedo belt is something like, what, 60-70%. So if you do get torped, which is pretty common, these low tier torpedo boats are heavy torpedo spammers, you kind of get punished quite hard. Now there's a reason why I'm talking a lot about the high tiers and the upcoming tiers, and that's because if you are at this tier, I'd like to give any new players an idea of what they're going to be, what they are basically leveling towards. Because at tier 4 it's very easy to change, it's very easy to switch into something else, and I cannot really with a straight face recommend the American battleship line right now, because I just think the Royal Navy battleship line is better. It's objectively better at pretty much all the things that it does. There are bright spots in this line, don't get me wrong. The tier 8, the North Carolina, is probably one of my favorite ships or favorite battleships in the game. While it's quite easy to punish if it gives broadside, it has especially accurate guns and great anti-air, which makes it a huge threat, and it takes all the things that make the American line, like it really shows the potential of what this full AA kind of ship, battleship line could be, with this very slow shells but very accurate shells, and it gives you the ultimate American battleship, I would say, in the game right now. Unlike the Iowa and Montana, where it's pretty questionable just how ultimate they are. The Orion has killed, I think, one of the threats he's been facing. I'm expecting him to kill the rest as well. In the meantime, though, I'm trying to pick off these targets that are in our base. In general, you kind of want to tank as much as possible in a battleship, but considering how slow you are, especially these low-tier American battleships are all very slow. In fact, speed is going to be a major issue for you. If you like speed, if you like fast-moving battleships, if you like this fast action, then American battleships are not for you, because the Wyoming is slow, the New York is slow, the New Mexico is slow, and the Colorado is slow. You have to endure, and even the South Carolina before this is slow. So you pretty much have to endure 4 extremely slow battleships. These are we're talking 20 to 21 knots of speed. These are all extremely sluggish. And you're gonna have to endure playing with these incredibly slow-moving battleships until you reach the North Carolina, which as I mentioned a couple of times already, is a battleship I value highly. That's when you finally start getting some speed and you can do more maneuvers, and you're not really as reliant on always positioning yourself optimally just to be able to take part in the battle as you are right now. Not surprisingly, if we look at the minimap, we can see that the Orion has managed to defend the base all alone and has killed all the cruisers and I think forced away the DD, and in general just dominated everything that happened in the spawn. And this is of course not something surprising to me. It's a broken ship. We mentioned it in testing, and not just me mentioning it in testing, but pretty much all the community contributors that spoke in the Discord laughed about how ridiculously overpowered that ship is. And Wargaming kind of ignored our feedback and released the ship as it is anyway, so not really much we can do about that except say that, well, we told you so. Not really much else to it. That Wyoming sitting on the border, securing that kill. Please don't play it like that. In general, try to avoid stopping your ship entirely when you're playing American battleships. These things are sluggish. They take a lot of time to get moving one way or another. And in general, you never really want to end up in this situation where I am now, which is you have nothing to shoot. Now, this is a bit of a special situation in the sense that there's only one ship left, which is the Orion. So and he was defending his base while I was defending mine, so it can be kind of excused. But in general, if you find yourself in a position where you don't have anyone to shoot and there's multiple enemies left, don't blame the ship. In general, you should probably be blaming your own positioning first. That's something that you see quite often, especially in these early stages, all the way up to the Colorado. The most common excuse is, I never make it in time. I don't have time to deal any damage before the battle ends or the game ends or whatever. And the ship is plenty fast enough to get you into any battle. All you need to do is look at the minimap, see where the enemy is going, and move in that direction. Ideally, of course, with your team. But if you play super safe and super far back, then don't blame the ship for when you are left out of the battle, because that is something we see. That is such a common excuse, and it just doesn't fly. 20 knots, while slow, is still fast enough to keep you in the battle. The reasoning that you're missing out on battles is not the lack of speed, but it's your own sailing. And Orion eats a bunch of torps, which I'm quite happy about, since otherwise he could probably kill us all. Okay, maybe not quite that strong, but let's just say it's a very scary ship. And this Wyoming game ends. Now, this might have felt like I talked about a lot of things besides the Wyoming in this commentary, and that's very much intentional, because the Wyoming isn't really that complex of a ship, and low-tier games aren't really that complex of games. You want to stick with your team, you want to punish any broadsides. Priority-wise, you shoot AP in this ship, and you try to avoid giving those flat broadsides unless when you need to use all your guns. The rest you angle. You turn in to shoot your guns, then you angle again. It's quite basic gameplay, especially at low tiers. And the point of this commentary was more to prepare people who are starting this American battleship line, prepare them for what is coming for them, so that they don't kind of just blindly walk into it and then get surprised that, like, what the hell, this isn't what I was expecting. trying to give you an idea of what is coming up in the future. 117k damage, which is quite nice for tier 4. 4 kills, didn't sadly get my Kraken. I would have in fact gotten my Kraken if that Wyoming in my spawn who was sitting on the border hadn't finished off that last kill, but still I'll take 11k XP considering you need something like 20k to move from Wyoming to New York, so that's pretty much half my grind done in a single game. Team score 1.3k base, that is pretty respectable. No surprise, the Orion on the enemy team is the top scorer. Once again, I think the ship is extremely stupid, but you have to take that up with Wargaming's balancing department, since clearly they know better than us poor fools who have merely been playing this game for years. And finally, of course, the detailed report. Not really much damage taken and not much potential damage either. And that's not really uncommon on these lower tiers. Battleships don't really feel like the tanks they are at these lower tiers, and that's mostly because they lack a lot of the tools that make them tanky, and in general they don't really have too much of a health to put them apart from the rest of the ship. So this tankier feature, basically all the ships kind of come into their own as they get higher up in tiers, and at this lower T3, T4 and maybe even towards T5, they kind of all meld together and feel kind of samey. And you only really start to notice these flavors the higher up in the ranks you rise. Because I mean, the difference between a Montana and a Des Moines is absolutely day and night, but the difference between a South Carolina and a St. Louis is not really that big. In fact, St. Louis can probably, tier 3 St. Louis can probably burn to death South Carolina without too many issues, whereas a Des Moines will get absolutely demolished by a Montana at high tier. So the balance does shift heavily in the favor of battleships the higher tier you go, but it is a learning experience, and that's probably the reason why the game is significantly more forgiving towards cruisers at lower tiers than the game is at higher tiers. Anyway, let me show you my recommended build and the build path that I recommend if you're going to start this American battleship line. Now, since I've already unlocked the Colorado, I'll just jump back a few tiers to show it this way. Shouldn't make any difference. Now, when it comes to Wyoming, the first upgrade you probably want to get is either going to be the speed upgrade, because the default speed is so horribly slow at 18 knots, 20.5. While it doesn't sound like much, it's still more than a 10% increase, which of course helps you quite a bit. So either get speed first or get the hull upgrade first. The hull upgrade, it doesn't really give you anything in terms of main artillery. I mean, it increases, yeah, it gives you 100 the turret traverse, a fair amount of turret traverse, which is useful, but the HE velocity and HE fire chance is not really that useful, since you want to be using mostly AP in this ship. You gain a small amount of AA, and you gain some rudder shift. Ultimately, you need to decide which one of these you value more. Getting the hull first is perfectly fine as well, but ultimately you want to get the speed and the hull both equally quickly, basically. And this range upgrade is by far the least important upgrade, since your dispersion is so bad at any sort of range that increasing it even further isn't really much of a priority. Now, you do want to get the range upgrade, of course, since it is still useful to be able to deal damage at range, but it's not a priority like the hull and the speed. Module wise, I think at this point you can't really run too many upgrades. I'm pretty sure you can only run the very basic ones, but ultimately you want to be using the same upgrades the entire way through, which is of course main armaments mod 1, which is what you spec quite early, and I don't know if you can get anything else. I think at tier 4 you might be able to get damage control mod 1, which you also want to spec into at this point. A bit extra tankiness. You don't really lose engine or rudder on battleships often at all, so it's not worth speccing into those at all. Captain perks wise, I would say on the Wyoming I would go for preventive maintenance first, but in later perks I prefer to get priority target, since you don't really lose turrets much or ever. In fact, preventive maintenance has lost a lot of value because of the introduction of the Royal Navy and the way the meta has shifted, or well, battleship players have been starting to spam more HE than AP, and this of course means that your turrets don't really get knocked out, since the HE doesn't really have the power to do that. So priority target becomes a lot more valuable. So maybe get priority target first, simply because of the way the meta has shifted. Follow it up with turret traverse. You want this on pretty much all battleships, but there are some faster turning battleships that can get away with not running it, but American ones have very slow turret traverse throughout the line, so you want to get this as a second perk. Third perk, Superintendent. Absolutely, additional heal is the most important thing you can get out of this, since it gives you so much more survivability. And then Concealment Expert. With everyone and their sister especially spamming HE, being able to disengage when you need to heal up and to survive and so forth is very, very important. Of course, it's more than just survivability. Concealment Expert allows you to open up from stealth while being undetected and catching people by surprise by suddenly popping up on their broadside. So this is both a defensive and offensive perk that I highly value on battleships. And 12-point captain, Adrenaline Rush. But I doubt you have made it. I doubt you have a captain this high at the Wyoming yet, but if you do, this is the build path I recommend. Later on though, I would save up for fire prevention, but since I can't afford the fire prevention, I only have a 14-point captain on my Colorado. I've just spec'd high alert for now, but later on, if I get a 3-point captain, I'll probably get basics of survivability. And if I happen to get a 4-point captain extra, then well, fire prevention. Obviously, ultimately you want fire prevention because it's so useful, especially now with the introduction of Royal Navy battleships. Flag-wise, US BBs share many things with other battleships, which is of course healing, fire prevention, or well, reduced time for fire extinguishing, and faster consumable reload. All these 3 flags are extremely valuable. I do like running Sierra Mike on my American battleships, and in general it's not really that good because it's a percentage based increase, which means US battleships that are already slow don't really gain much out of it, but it's mostly because you kind of take anything you can get when it comes to helping these ships out, because they are so goddamn slow, and that's of course one of the major weaknesses of this line in general. Anyway, that was my Wyoming commentary. Sorry about showing so much Colorado here, but as I said, I've been advancing through the line very, very quickly. It hasn't taken me many games to move through the line, so I'm going to be covering the US battleship line quite quickly, all the way to probably North Carolina, since I already got a fully upgraded Colorado. Anyway, thank you for watching. I'll talk to you guys later.